Today we are going to explore one of the great twists in medieval military history, how low-status soldiers came to determine the outcome of the greatest battles of the Middle Ages, overcoming the most powerful warrior elite of their era. This is the legacy of medieval archers, men whose skills changed the course of European history forever. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. For centuries, the human imagination was captured by the imposing figure of the medieval knight. Covered in gleaming steel, mounted on a powerful steed armed with lance and sword, he symbolized the supreme force of warfare in the Middle Ages. He was the embodiment of military power, nobility, and chivalric honor. Knights were trained from adolescence, belonged to the highest strata of society, and dominated the battlefield like no other soldier of the era. They represented not just a fighting force, but an entire philosophy of war. The belief that individual courage and the moral superiority of the noble warrior were the decisive factors in any conflict. At least, that was what was believed for generations, and that was what the historical records of the time seemed to confirm repeatedly. But behind this grand narrative lies another story, equally fascinating yet far less celebrated. It is the story of men who wore no gilded armor nor rode war horses. Men who, most of the time, came from the countryside, from villages, from the margins of feudal society. They were the archers, and during the most decisive period of the European Middle Ages, they completely transformed the nature of warfare, and did so in a way that left even the most seasoned knights powerless before their systematic and relentless effectiveness. To understand why medieval archers were so feared, one must step back in time and understand what the European battlefield was like before the rise of this force. Between the 9th and 11th centuries, warfare on the continent was dominated by heavy cavalry. Charlemagne's Franks, William the Conqueror's Normans, the Knights of the Crusades, all built their reputation upon the overwhelming force of the mounted charge. The idea was simple and brutally effective. Concentrate heavily armed men on powerful horses and hurl them at the enemy at top speed. The kinetic impact of a well-executed charge could shatter almost any infantry formation, both psychologically and physically. It was a tactic that combined brute force with intimidation power and worked for generations without effective challenge. This model created a war culture that placed the value of the individual warrior above almost everything else. Knights invested fortunes in their armor and in war horses specifically bred for combat, animals larger and stronger than ordinary horses. Only wealthy families could afford a knight, and only the best reached the top of the military hierarchy. A worldview was forged where war was, ultimately, about demonstrating the superiority of the noble individual, a closed system deeply resistant to external questioning coming from the lower strata of society. In this context, the archer was viewed with a certain disdain. Fighting from a distance was considered in many European medieval cultures an inferior practice to direct confrontation. Chivalric codes of honor valued face-to-face combat and the demonstration of personal courage in close proximity to the adversary. Shooting arrows from afar seemed to these knights fundamentally dishonorable, a cowardly act practiced by those who lacked the courage to fight for real. This perception, however, was about to be radically and definitively challenged by the events unfolding in the British Isles. The change did not happen overnight. It was slow, gradual, and linked to the development of a specific weapon that would transform medieval warfare irreversibly, the longbow. But before talking about this weapon, one must understand where the men who wielded it came from, because the history of medieval archers is, above all, a story about people, about traditions, and about skills passed down from generation to generation in communities where the bow was an integral part of cultural identity. In the forests and fields of Wales, during the 12th and 13th centuries, lived a people with an archery tradition deeply rooted in their culture. The Welsh developed a unique skill in handling bows made of yew, a dense, flexible, and exceptionally tough wood that grew in the British forests. The medieval chronicler Gerald of Wales, writing in the late 12th century, described with admiration the skill of the South Welsh archers, especially those of Gwent, whose arrows, according to him, penetrated oak doors several inches thick. When the English kings pacified Wales, they found in this tradition an invaluable military resource that did not need to be created from scratch, only systematized and expanded. The longbow measured between 1.7 and 1.9 meters in length, practically the height of an adult man of the era. Made from a single piece of yew wood, it ingeniously exploited the natural properties of this timber. The outer side, the sapwood, was naturally elastic and resistant to tension. The inner side, the heartwood, was denser and resistant to compression. Together, they created a natural composite effect, capable of storing and releasing energy extraordinarily well. The finest bows were made from yew trunks that grew slowly on north-facing slopes, where the wood developed denser, more uniform fibers. Precision instruments of craftsmanship that could last for years when properly maintained, treated by the archers as precious tools of their trade. A skilled archer could shoot between 10 and 12 arrows per minute with reasonable accuracy. In comparison, a crossbow allowed only 2 or 3 shots per minute under ideal conditions. The difference was massive in mass tactical combat contexts. And when that rate of fire was multiplied by hundreds, sometimes thousands of archers on the field, the result was a rain of missiles that completely altered the dynamics of any engagement. The arrows used by English archers were crafted with equal care. Bodkin points, elongated and narrow, were designed to penetrate mail and the most vulnerable parts of armor. Broadhead points, wider, were effective against unarmored targets. The choice depended on the circumstances of each combat situation, demonstrating that medieval archers were professionals who thought and adapted their resources. To draw the longbow effectively required a draw weight of between 68 and 80 kilograms. Some bows even demanded over 90 kilograms, an effort of extraordinary magnitude, performed repeatedly for years on end, starting in youth. The consequences were visible on the very bodies of these men. Studies of skeletons found in the wreck of the English ship Mary Rose, sunk in 1545, revealed significant bone alterations. The left shoulders and arms of these men were noticeably denser and more developed than those of the general population. There were clear modifications to the spine and joints. These were bodies literally molded by the incessant practice of a single skill, a permanent physical mark, that modern researchers identify centuries later. Unlike knights who came from the nobility, archers were predominantly commoners, free peasants, agricultural workers, sons of yeomen, the small landowners who formed the backbone of English rural society. Training began early and lasted a lifetime, spanning generations, while English kings even enacted laws requiring free men to practice archery regularly, evidence of the importance the crown placed on this skill. They had no titles or heraldic coats of arms. They had a bow and years of accumulated practice that could neither be bought nor conferred by birth. A yeoman armed with his longbow could, under the right conditions, neutralize the threat of a knight worth 100 times more economically. For the nobility, this represented a profound disruption of the natural order of things, a challenge not merely tactical, but philosophical and cultural. While the English longbow was being perfected in the British Isles, another type of missile weapon was gaining ground on the European continent, the crossbow. Unlike the longbow, which required years of intensive physical training, the crossbow was a mechanical weapon that could be mastered in weeks of basic instruction. Genoese crossbowmen were the most highly regarded professionals on the continent, mercenaries organized into specialized companies, carrying their crossbows, bolts, and large wooden shields called pavises for protection while reloading. However, the crossbow had a critical limitation. Its rate of fire was drastically lower, 2 or 3 bolts per minute compared to the 10 or 12 of the longbow, and it was particularly sensitive to moisture, which could completely compromise the mechanism. A difference that, under certain circumstances, proved to be absolutely decisive. These differences were put to the test in dramatic fashion across a series of battles that would mark medieval military history forever. An eloquent foretaste came in Kortrijk, Belgium, in July 1302, when a French cavalry army was repelled by Flemish militia using pikes and spears to create a formation impenetrable to the mounted charge. The Battle of the Golden Spurs demonstrated something European aristocracy preferred not to accept. Heavy cavalry was not invincible. The right conditions, the right terrain, and the right formation could completely neutralize it. and the battles that followed would confirm this lesson with unsettling repetition. It was the wars between England and France, the 100 Years' War which began in 1337, that placed archers at the absolute center of European history. King Edward III developed a strategic vision, combining the offensive power of archers with the defensive solidity of dismounted men-at-arms. Instead of attacking with cavalry charges, the English built defensive positions and waited for the enemy. Archers were placed on the flanks, protected by difficult terrain. Men-at-arms formed the stout center. As the enemy advanced, the archers would fire in coordinated volume, creating overwhelming pressure. Those who reached the hand-to-hand combat line would arrive exhausted and disordered, facing the English men-at-arms in advantageous positions. It was a tactic that demanded collective discipline, and one that, in the hands of English commanders, would produce extraordinary results. The first major test of this doctrine came in August 1346 in northern France, Crécy-en-Ponthieu. The Battle of Crécy was a watershed moment in European military history, an event that permanently transformed the understanding of what was possible on a battlefield and where victory could truly come from. The English army of Edward III had advanced deep into France, demonstrating French inability to protect their territory. King Philip VI mobilized his army to intercept the invaders, assembling a numerically superior force that included the realm's high nobility and the renowned Genoese crossbowmen. The English chose their ground carefully and well in advance, a slight rise with flanks protected by slopes and vegetation that would hinder cavalry movements. Archers were placed in forward positions on the flanks, in a staggered formation that maximized the field of fire, a defensive position that forced the enemy to attack uphill under conditions that became progressively more unfavorable with every meter of advance. The battle began in the late afternoon of August 26, 1346. The Genoese crossbowmen were sent forward, but arrived fatigued after hours of marching. A sudden thunderstorm had soaked the strings of their crossbows, reducing their firing power. The Genoese had left their pavesy shields behind in the rushed march, left without protection as they operated their slow weapons. The English archers, for their part, had kept their bows in leather cases during the rain, preserving string elasticity. When the Genoese attempted to fire, their bolts fell short of the English range. The archers responded with a volume of arrows so dense that the Genoese fell back without establishing an effective line of fire. The French cavalry, furious at what they interpreted as cowardice on the part of the Italian mercenaries, charged directly over their own retreating crossbowmen, creating a chaos that was in itself a decisive factor. The French cavalry charged repeatedly during that afternoon, which bled into the night. Each charge was met with concentrated volleys from the English archers positioned on the flanks. The horses, which could not be fully protected by armor, were an especially vulnerable target. Many crashed down, throwing their riders. Dismounted knights, encased in heavy armor, struggled immensely to move across the uneven ground of the hill. French historical records describe roughly 15 separate charges during that afternoon and night, each repulsed with growing losses. It was a repetition on a grander scale of the lesson from Kortrijk. Heavy cavalry, facing the right terrain and the right defense, proved far more vulnerable than its reputation suggested. The outcome of Crécy was devastating for France. Historical estimates suggest the French army lost between 1,500 and 2,000 knights, the flower of nobility, alongside a vastly larger number of lower-ranking soldiers. English losses were a tiny fraction of that total. Philip VI escaped with his life, but politically humiliated. Crécy had demonstrated unequivocally that well-trained and well-positioned archers could destroy a numerically superior cavalry army. Yet the most common response in France was rationalization. The terrain was unfavorable. The Genoese had failed. The problem lay in execution, not concept. This inability to learn exacted a massive price in the years that followed. 10 years after Crécy, in September 1356, history repeated itself on the outskirts of Poitiers, in the heart of France. The Black Prince, Edward of Woodstock, son of Edward III, at the head of an Anglo-Gascon force, was intercepted by a much larger army led by King John II himself. Prospects looked grim for the English. They were outnumbered and far from their bases. But the Black Prince chose a position on a hill covered with mature vineyards and thick hedges, vegetation that made a cavalry charge extremely difficult and provided natural cover for the archers positioned on the flanks. The battle followed the field-tested pattern: archers on the flanks, terrain preventing free cavalry maneuver, the steady English formation responding to French attempts to breach the defensive line. The French tried different approaches, including dismounted knights advancing on foot in heavy armor. Yet advancing uphill, through vineyards and hedges, under a continuous rain of arrows, exhausted the men long before contact with the enemy. The outcome of Poitiers was even more dramatic than Crécy. King John II of France himself was captured by the English, an unprecedented humiliation for the French monarchy. The demanded ransom was fixed at 3 million gold crowns, equivalent to several years of the kingdom's total revenue, a sum the French state was never able to raise fully during the king's lifetime. Between Poitiers and the next major clash, decades of irregular warfare and negotiations passed. France suffered internal convulsions of extraordinary magnitude. The Black Death returned in repeated outbreaks throughout the second half of the 14th century, decimating populations with absolute indiscriminacy. Civil wars between noble factions and dynastic instability weakened the French state to its foundations. England, meanwhile, consolidated its military reputation and continually refined the tactics that had produced its greatest victories. It was in this context that the young English King Henry V decided in 1415 to lead an army to France to claim the French throne by dynastic right. The campaign met difficulties from the start. The siege of the town of Harfleur caused significant losses through disease. By the time Henry marched toward Calais, his army was diminished and weakened. The French army, vastly superior in numbers and including the highest nobility of the realm, motivated by the memory of past humiliations and determined to erase decades of defeat, intercepted the English near the village of Agincourt in English spelling, on October 25, 1415. But Henry V was a commander who deeply understood the nature of his archers' tactical advantage. He chose a position between two woods that narrowed the battlefield, preventing the French cavalry from maneuvering to the flanks. He ordered his archers to drive sharpened wooden stakes into the ground in front of their positions, a crude yet effective physical barrier against a cavalry charge. The field was deeply churned with mud after days of Norman autumn rain, and this thick mud was a devastating obstacle for heavily armored knights trying to advance in tight formation. English archers, lightly armored or unarmored, retained the mobility required to operate effectively even under these adverse conditions. When Henry realized the French army was unwilling to advance, he took the bold decision to move his entire line forward, getting close enough for his archers to come within effective range of the longbow. The French were forced to advance in response. The mounted cavalry surged through the muddy field and was met by volleys from the English archers. Horses were the primary target. Many went down, creating additional obstacles for those behind them. The charge disintegrated long before reaching the English line with any coherent force. The French heavy infantry that advanced next faced the same dilemma on an expanded scale. Encumbered by heavy armor, slogging through deep mud under a continuous shower of arrows, the knights and men-at-arms reached the English line exhausted and disordered. The French formation, compressed between the two woods, created a crush that made it impossible to wield weapons effectively. What should have been the most fearsome force in Europe had been transformed into a packed mass of metal and exhaustion. The English men-at-arms, rested and well-positioned, stepped forward to finish the fight. The estimates most widely accepted by modern historiography suggest France lost over 2,000 knights and nobles killed at Agincourt, alongside a far greater number taken prisoner. English losses were comparatively minimal. Agincourt immediately became legend. For the English, it was a victory that seemed to confirm with irresistible force that their model of warfare was superior to any force the continent could field against them. For the French, it was a national catastrophe that accelerated a profound political crisis, paving the way for the English occupation of Paris and for treaties that severely compromised the kingdom's sovereignty. To fully understand why archers were so feared, one must imagine what it meant to be on the receiving end of a coordinated longbow volley. An archer fired on a high trajectory, an arced shot, causing the arrow to rise and fall almost vertically onto the enemy at distances of up to 300 meters. This method required not individual accuracy, but collective coordination, hundreds of archers shooting on the same signal, creating a concentration of missiles that made dodging virtually impossible for any tight formation. 200 archers shooting 10 arrows per minute sent 2,000 arrows in 60 seconds. 1,000 archers produced 10,000 arrows per minute, a volume unparalleled by any previous military technology in European history. Each arrow carried enough kinetic energy to be potentially fatal, or to completely disorient a knight, even if it failed to penetrate his armor. Then there was the matter of horses, which proved decisive in battle after battle. In many medieval military cultures, the warhorse was treated as a precious asset representing considerable financial investment and years of specialized training. Fully armoring a horse was virtually impossible without fatally compromising its mobility, the very qualities that made cavalry valuable in the first place. This left significant portions of the animal exposed. English archers, positioned on the flanks, could strike the animals at angles that any frontal protection was unable to cover. A horse struck by multiple missiles became unpredictable and dangerous to its own rider, capable of sending waves of chaos cascading through the entire advancing formation. The psychological impact on combatants was equally devastating. Advancing toward an enemy that could not be immediately reached, while missiles continuously rained down all around, demanded a level of discipline extraordinarily difficult to sustain. The constant noise, the awareness that comrades were falling with every step, all of this progressively eroded the cohesion of enemy formations long before physical contact. French knights who survived the great battles described in letters and chronicles the sound of arrows tearing through the air like a continuous downpour, an image that captures both the ubiquity and the psychological terror of such an attack. European armies attempted to adapt to the reality English battles repeatedly demonstrated. One of the most systematic responses was the refinement of armor. During the 14th and early 15th centuries, armorers worked with increasing sophistication to create curved surfaces that deflected missiles rather than absorbing them head-on. However, this development never fully neutralized the archer's advantage. There were always vulnerable points at the joints and helmet slits. Paradoxically, more sophisticated armor made knights heavier and more dependent on their mounts to maintain mobility. The armor meant to be the solution became part of the problem, especially when a knight found himself on foot, in difficult terrain, having lost his horse. As the 15th century progressed, the strategic context began to shift in ways no medieval tactic could anticipate. The gradual introduction of firearms, first siege cannons, then portable field weapons, altered the balance of power on the battlefield in ways the longbow could not replicate. Firearms did not require grueling physical training. The decisive argument in their favor was not about rate of fire, it was about the training required. Producing effective archers took years starting in youth. Training a basic firearm marksman could be done in weeks. For a state needing to mobilize large armies quickly, this difference was simply decisive. The Battle of Flodden in 1513 was one of the last major moments of prominence for the English longbow on the European battlefield. After that, bows were relegated to secondary roles, while firearms redefined the entire logic of combat. The legacy of medieval archers, however, extends far beyond the battles in which they fought. They left deep marks on the art of war that influenced military thought in subsequent centuries. The demonstration that numerical superiority and social prestige do not automatically determine the outcome of a battle. That terrain, collective discipline, and concentrated firepower can overcome seemingly overwhelming advantages was a lesson that commanders of following centuries studied carefully. In English culture, the archer with his longbow became an iconic figure, occupying a central place in national identity for centuries. The legend of Robin Hood, whose stories coalesced precisely during the period when English archers dominated European battlefields, expressed in mythical form something real about the social dynamics of the time, the image of the common man who, with his bow, defied and overcame the powerful. It was the legendary expression of the historical reality of medieval archers, men of humble origin, whose skills made the warrior nobility's claim to innate superiority questionable in the practical reality of the battlefield. The question that remains after all this analysis is the one at the center of the lived experience of the knights who faced English archers at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt. Why was the most highly trained warrior elite of medieval Europe so systematically defeated by men of humble origin wielding wooden bows? The answer is manifold. The longbow was, within its specific context, a disruptive weapon, relatively cheap in terms of raw materials, yet devastatingly effective when used in mass by trained archers on suitable terrain. The English commanders who utilized it, Edward III, the Black Prince, Henry V, were exceptionally skilled at selecting terrain and creating conditions that maximized the archer's advantages while methodically neutralizing those of enemy cavalry. Victory at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt was not just about the weapon, it was about the tactical intelligence with which it was employed in carefully chosen contexts. There was also a cultural factor persistently working against French knights. Chivalric tradition predisposed them, battle after battle, to charge head-on with assaults that were precisely what English archers needed to exert their full effectiveness. The French nobility was captive to a vision of warfare that valued individual honor and direct confrontation above collective tactical efficiency. And this vision led them, battle after battle, to repeat variations of the same fundamental mistakes. The inability to adapt quickly to a new tactical reality was, in the end, just as decisive as the archer's skill itself. The story of medieval archers is ultimately a story about how actual power rarely matches perceived power. For generations, knights were the dominant force in medieval warfare, and dominant they were. But when conditions changed, when a different set of skills, tools, and tactics was developed and systematized by those willing to think beyond established traditions, perception collapsed spectacularly before the reality of the battlefield. Archers, viewed as inferior and dishonorable, proved that war respects neither social hierarchies nor reputations built on past traditions. It respects only real effectiveness in the present moment. The knights of Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt were victims, first and foremost, of their own inability to adapt to a changing reality. The archers who faced them were the agents of this transformation, men who, with yew bows and carefully crafted arrows, redefined what military power was and where it could truly come from. Not from titles or coats of arms, from skill, discipline, and years of silent dedication to a craft their contemporaries barely respected, yet history judged very differently. These men shaped the course of European warfare without ever being celebrated to the measure of their contribution. And that is why their story still reaches us with such force, centuries later. If this narrative reached you with any force, if these men of Gwent, Yorkshire, and Agincourt awakened something within you, then you already know what to do next. Subscribe to this channel. Every subscriber is like one more arrow in the quiver, strengthening this community of people who believe the past has something essential to teach us about the present. Leave your like. It is the simplest and most powerful sign that this story was worth your time. And in the comments, tell us, which aspect of this journey surprised you the most? Which battle would you like to explore in greater depth? We are here to continue this conversation because history does not end when the documentary finishes. It stays alive in every question we ask together.